Okay. All right, Boker Tov. So we begin a new Masechet today, Masechet Moed Katan, Beis Amud Aleph, Daf Beis. A few introductory words about this Masechet. First of all, interestingly, there's a bit of a debate whether the same way there's a debate about what the last two prakim of Megillah were, what the order was. Here, there's also a debate whether Moed Katan is the last tractate of the Masechet or whether Chagiga is. The normal assumption is that Moed Katan is first and then Chagiga, although some do have it in the reverse order. The normal way to know, most people say, well, which makes more thematic sense, but actually, as scholars have long pointed out, the real order of the tractates in a Masechet, in a Seder, go by the number of prakim. The problem is that these last two tractates have the same number of prakim, 3. So just to be aware, there is some debate. But anyway, we're going to do Moed Katan and then Chagiga, which means we're 2 months away from finishing Seder Moed, which is exciting. And that is true. Now, this Masechet is called, Moed Katan. Well, we call it Moed Katan. A lot of the Rishonim don't call it Moed Katan. They call it Masechet Mashkin, based on the first word, which is unusual because normally you don't have a Masechet called by the first word. All right, that's by chance. But here, part of the reason is because normally it's called by the theme, but here there's a mixture of themes. It starts right at the beginning, as we're going to see, by certain things that can be done on Chol HaMoed, or what are the rules of Chol HaMoed, which makes sense. After you deal with all of the Chagim, you deal with Chol HaMoed, and then Chagiga deals with, the bringing of the Korban Chagiga, which is sort of like some mitzvos that apply across the Moedim, not particular to any particular Moed. But again, let's focus on the other sort of like restrictions and malacha and so on, and therefore that's what this is doing here in this tractate, and after all of the other sort of Moedim have been dealt with. At the same time, if you take just a quick look at the first 5 words, Mashkin Beit HaShalchin b'Moed u'b'Shvi'it, that a lot of the things that you can do and not do on Chol HaMoed parallel certain things about what you can and can't do on the Shemitah. So already there's a mixture of themes there. And in addition to Chol HaMoed and Shvi'it, the other big issue that comes up is Avelut, okay? And Elu Megalchim, the third parak, is pretty much all about Avelut, and even that is not limited to Avelut. It gets into other issues, Nidui and Nizirut, and so on. Now again, there's a tie-in, because it starts with Ve'elu Megalchim b'Moed. The follow people can shave on Chol HaMoed, but that gets you into questions about, well, shaving, and what other times somebody doesn't shave, Avelut, and so on, and then it leads to all of these major discussions of Avelut. So the major locus of Hilchot Avelut in the Gemara is in the third parak. So that's sort of the topics are basically Chol HaMoed, Avelut, a little Shvius, a little of other things, and hence it's not surprising that some, therefore, don't, rather than giving it a more descriptive name of Moed Katan, the small Moed, meaning Chol HaMoed, call it Mashkin. But nevertheless, it does seem that the basic sort of framing issues are the Chol HaMoed issues. One other point about this Masechet, about the commentaries just that we'll be referring to, is, as you might have remembered from a previous Masechtot when we deal with Ta'anit and so on, the whole issue about is Rashi the real Rashi, and the scholarly consensus was no. There was even a scholarly consensus that the Tosfos wasn't a normal Tosfos, was a very late Tosfos. Here, pretty much everybody acknowledges that the Rashi is not Rashi. Rashi is about 80% of Rabbeinu Gershom, a commentary of Rabbeinu Gershom. And what's fascinating is, if I hadn't told you that, you might not have actually realized it, because it's a line-by-line commentary. It's pretty terse and to the point and clear, which is an interesting thing, when we always sort of say that, like, Rashi was the first one to really do a running commentary on the Gemara and so on. I mean, it's true in terms of its comprehensiveness and its clarity and so on, but it's not like there were no precedents. Rabbeinu Hananel also, which is printed on the side. Now again, Rabbeinu Hananel is usually much sparser in terms of what he comments on and not comments on. But if you get a chance and you want to look at what's printed as the Rashi, which is really Rabbeinu Gershom, it'll seem pretty much like a reasonable, Rakshi. You might not even have fully realized it. But it's basically 80% Rabbeinu Gershom, 20% taken from the text we have of Rashi. We actually do have the manuscript of Rashi, and it's been printed in a separate little book, which is Perush Rashi on Maseches Moed Katan. Okay, so I thought I had it at home. I couldn't find it, but I'm pretty sure we have it in the base Medrash. And the Rashi on the Rif, actually, which normally is not its own manuscript, but normally it is sort of a editing and a reworking of Rashi on the Gemara. They print the Rashi and the Rif in the back. Here in Moed Katan, and like I think one other place, it actually is pretty much from like an accurate a witness to one of the manuscripts of Rashi. So actually the better Rashi on Moed Katan, the real Rashi, can be found more in the Rif, but there actually is a scholarly edition of it. While we're talking about the Rif, I should mention that, just to make things fun, the Ran on the Rif in Moed Katan, and the general rule, is not the Ran. It's Nimukei Yosef. So, okay, the Rashi on the Rif is real Rashi, more than in other Masechtas, but the Ran is not the Ran. Anyway, so just to be aware, if I point out something in Rashi, it's really Rabbeinu Gershom. Okay, Rabbeinu Gershom was, before. How well before? Yeah, I was going to say, I don't know. I know it was the previous 10th century, 11th century. I don't know, it was 50 years or 100 years. I don't have the exact date. I don't know. Must be that the printer did not have, I don't know the history of that. Could be the printer didn't have the manuscript available to him. Could be the printer had the manuscript of Rabbeinu Gershom and thought it was Rashi. I don't know.
Rabbeinu Gershom died in either 1028 or 1040. Rashi died in 1105.
Okay, so there you go. About 80 years.
Yeah,
At least their death dates differ by about 80 years. Okay, so let's take a look now. Now we begin. Okay, so Mashkin Beit HaShalchin b'Moed, you can irrigate a Beit HaShalchin on Chol HaMoed. Beit HaShalchin is basically like a field that is irrigated, but that requires regular irrigation. And therefore, if it requires regular irrigation, by not watering it, you will, the crops are at serious risk. A field that doesn't require regular irrigation, as we learned by Tanis, you need rain, but there are fields that are much more, the soil is richer, other types of factors which I'm sure I'm completely ignorant of, but that doesn't require, as much regular water and normally can be totally fine by the rainfall, is one that's less at risk. But something that there are these fields that require, one of the amazing things that they're doing in developing countries, right, is new technology to figure out how to, because I saw this a few years ago when I was in Senegal, about how to, with a very minimal amount of water, but because of just, the amount that they do in terms of the way they spray it and, doing it in very precise amounts, that they can really, it's amazing how much they can grow crops with a very minimal amount of water if the technology is right, if they're using exactly the amount they need and the way they need it,
You need to take that technology to California today.
Yeah, okay, there you go. So anyway, but obviously water is critical for crops, for fields that need regular irrigation. So here the basic rule is that you can do malacha on Chol HaMoed if it's a concern about davar ha'avad, something about a loss, a financial loss, or hefsed. Okay, now let's take a look at the Rashi, Rabbeinu Gershom, for this point, just because one of the important themes that we're going to be addressing is what is the nature of the Isser Malacha on Chol HaMoed. And that falls into two types of question. One is not the question of the weight, biblical, rabbinic, what are the special allowances, but what type of malacha is prohibited? When I say malacha on Shabbos, we've all been well trained to understand that malacha doesn't mean laborious work. It means creative labor. It's defined by 39, constructive, creative categories, etc. When we say don't do malacha on Chol HaMoed, is that what we mean? Do we mean the lamites malachos? And therefore, anytime you allow me to do anything on Chol HaMoed, like strike a match, I need a heter for it? Is that what we're talking about? Or do we mean don't do stuff that's tircha, that's laborious, that's effortful, right? That's one question of what constitutes malacha for purposes of Chol HaMoed. There's another question, which is, what is the weight of the prohibition? And therefore, is it biblical? Is it rabbinic? Is it somewhere in between? What are special cases of allowances? And so on. So those are the two major questions, as others, but two major questions that we have to be asking as we go through this Masechet. So let's take a look at Rashi. Yes, yes. Yes, we will see. There will be these things coming up in the Gemara, but as is usual, it will not, there will be a lot of ambiguity about them. But yes, I'm not just saying them They'll be rooted in discussions in the Gemara. So let's take a look at Rashi. Rashi says like this. Rabbeinu Gershom, whatever. Maskin beis hashachim Moed, first one. Sadashi omeres bahar v'tzarich lashkoso tamid matkinos afilu b'cholosh Moed. Lefi shu hefsed gadol. It would be a large loss. So is it any hefsed gadol? In eno mashkelto v'davar shel hefsed hitiru chachamim litroach bo b'cholosh Moed. And a matter of loss, chachamim allowed you to be matriach. So there, A, you have chachamim allowing it, and B, you have the emphasis of tircha, which doesn't mean the malach is defined by tircha, but it sounds like tircha is a big factor here. Now Rashi quotes a source, not interestingly in Moed Katan, but in Chagiga. So interestingly, although the Torah only speaks about not doing malacha on the first day and the seventh day, because it puts it in the category of other days, or other days in its category, you learn from it that malacha is also forbidden on other days. Maybe all malacha is forbidden on Chol HaMoed. The seventh, only the seventh is fully forbidden. The ain shisha asurim mikol and the other six are not. Now, this sounds very biblical. You're learning it out from a pasuk. Halo masan akasav ela lechachamim. So the what is forbidden and what is not, that's for the rabbis to figure out. The verse gave it over to the rabbis. Lo masan akasav ela lechachamim. Lo marlach to tell you, eiz malacha asurim mikol shemoed, veiz muteres. Umalacha sheyesh bo hefseid imeno oselta, something that will have a loss. Kol hashkos beis hashochin hitiru chachamim, the chachamim allowed it. So Rashi does not for us define what malacha is. What types of malacha are asur? Are they defined by these lamitetz categories? Are they defined by tircha? Although he mentions tircha, is that their definition? How about the idea that we make an allowance for davar hefseid? Has Rashi told us whether malacha is biblical or rabbinic on Chol HaMoed? What do you think? Has Rashi told us whether malacha is biblical or rabbinic? No, he hasn't. On the one hand, he quoted verses. They sounded like very biblical based, real drashot. Then he had this phrase, "Lo masrin hakasuv elu l'chachamim," and then he said, and therefore the rabbis allowed it. So some could say, so it means at the end it's really rabbinic. But it doesn't sound like that. It sounds like it's some space in between. That the Torah says there are some things forbidden. The Torah is saying, I'm not going to dictate exactly what those things are. You, the rabbis, you figure out what is included in the biblical prohibitions of Chol HaMoed. So as opposed to other times where we, sort of see it as all linked to hints in the verse, and ultimately we're uncovering what the verse is either telling us or hinting to us or so on. Here it's like you guys got a blank check, but at the end of the day, that check is being drawn on my account, right? So at the end of the day, whatever you fill in, that's what the Torah is forbidding. That is one way of understanding it, that it really is biblical with a lot of latitude for the sages. The funny thing is about that approach is that it's one thing to say, I get to figure out the parameters, but then to say on an ongoing basis, I could say, and it could be overwritten for reasons A, B, and C, that to override doesn't sound like included in the general license to define the basic parameters, right? It's one thing to say, okay, I'm going to give the list of the malachos that are forbidden on Chol HaMoed, and that then becomes what's biblically forbidden. But then to say, and I can say, and it can be overridden for this reason or that reason, that already makes it sound like something not of biblical weight, something more like you can have overrides, okay? And that's going to be part of this ongoing tension of the nature of the weight of the Yisur Malacha on Chol HaMoed. I will just point out that there's a parallel discussion by the Inuyim on Yom Kippur, right? The other things other than eating and drinking, right? Bathing, sex, anointing, and so on. Similar ambiguity. The Gemara learns it out from verses. It makes it sound like it's biblical. Of course, it's not exactly clear how you get those particular ones, although there's a sugya about that. And then at the other hand, you get overrides. What are the overrides for the Inuyim? Like a kala, right? A recently married woman, a king, certain types of circumstances that we can say that, in that case, special case, we'll let you bathe, or we'll let you do certain things on Yom Kippur. So that makes it sound like it's only rabbinic, okay? So again, it's not just that the rabbis figure out the parameters. The fact that there are overrides raise questions to whether or not this is really something that is biblical. So this is like the basic question. A, what's its weight? What's its source? Is it biblical, rabbinic? Is it somewhere in between? And B, what exactly is the character of the Isser Malach on Chol HaMoed? Yes.
It's so unreasonable to imagine that the Malach is determined by the context rather than the kind of categorical definition. Just we're kind of trained and accustomed to thinking in categorical definition.
Okay, so what you're saying is, and this is something also that is said by, for example, the Kala washing the face on Yom Kippur, is that you have to view that as an override, or can you say in those circumstances it's not about tainug, it's the sort of, and it's about something else. Okay, so it is possible, that's true, to recharacterize it. Again, to say malacha done to prevent a loss is not real malacha. Okay, but maybe you'll define it. You know what type of malacha we're talking about? We're talking about malachas harvacha. We're not talking about malachas manias hefsed, and it's part of the character of it, rather than an override. So that is possible. Whether it'll always work, but that is definitely a possible way to sort of find a path. Not frame it as an override, but frame it as giving it a different character.
Yeah, but it's still the same. I'm still plowing my field regardless.
I understand. So what Dov is saying is, if you don't think in terms of lamites malachas, right? If I say, don't go into work on Chol Moed, right? So, I'm trying to think of an example. Yeah, watch TV. Okay, but you shouldn't be working on your computer on Chol Moed. Well, let's say I'm reading a novel on my computer. Or what I'm saying? Sometimes, yeah, if you're thinking not in terms of like technical malachot, but more the purpose and the goals of it, and it's more about profession, and of course this is also professional, but it's maybe a different quality to the malacha. It's definitely something to think about, okay? And you're right. Then we have to think in very different types of categories, and that's an interesting thing about Melechas Chol Moed, that they might not at all follow the normal types of lamites. Other types of things you have are things like Meleches Uman, right? Is it craftsman labor or not craftsman labor, right? So it could be the exact same in terms of a Shabbos category, but how much is it something that's skilled in craftsman labor as opposed to not? These are types of issues that we will see. Let's keep on going. Just putting all those things on the table. Okay, so now it continues. Okay, so Ma'ashim Beis HaShachim b'Moed u'b'Shvi'it, on Shemitah it's allowed as well. Now that should be a shocker, right? Because if Shemitah you're not allowed to water your field, no, but that's a deal, right? To tending to your crops and whatever on Shemitah. And how does Hefsed allow it? So that's going to be a big issue.
Well, but you're allowed to eat too on Shemitah.
All right. We'll see. Whether from a spring that has just originally emerged or whether one that has not originally emerged, it's more obvious if it has not originally emerged, because that means that it is like, it's sort of the structure has been established, like the spring and the furrow and all of that, and you're not afraid that it'll collapse when you go ahead and use the water from it. Whereas something that's new, it might dry up, it might collapse, and then it would lead to doing a lot of work. So therefore, you might not want to allow it because it might lead to a lot of work. And nevertheless, it's allowed because this is a makom hefsed. You cannot use it from collected rainwater, which is a lot more effort, right? Sort of basically drawing it from like water that's collected in these buckets. And not from water from a pipe or a device that was used to like raise water from the bottom of a deep well. Those are things that are too effortful and tircha, and therefore not allowed.
So if you collected rainwater, you can't use it.
Right. I mean, we're not talking about like, I don't know, take a little bit of water. We're talking about a whole effort of like drawing water from a well. So that's like, that is much more effortful, and therefore that is not allowed. The Ein Osim, again, I don't know enough about, agriculture and those realities, but we can sort of trust that there was a huge difference in effort here. The Ein Osim Ugiyot Legefanim, you cannot make furrows around the vines, because the digging furrows so that when the water falls, it collects and it stays in that place and continues to nurture the vines. Presumably, again, the question we have to ask is what we see implicit in the beginning of the Mishnah is you're allowed to do things for derech when it's b'makom hefsed, but not if it's too much tircha. So, for example, not allowing ugiyot legefanim, is that because it's not considered hefsed? More logically, it is because it would be too much tircha, digging those things. Circle, right? So, right, so exactly. And some wanted to say that Choni HaMe'agel was not because of the circle he drew, was because he dug ditches by vines, and therefore he was very sensitive to the need of rain. Okay, Rabbi Eliezer ben Azariah Omer, anyway, these are the two criteria. It has to be makom hefsed, and it can't be too much tircha. Rabbi Eliezer ben Azariah Omer, ein osim et ha'ama batchila b'moed u'b'shvi'i. You cannot initially make a furrow to run water through. Furrow is probably not. How do they translate it? Irrigation canal. Thank you. What were you saying, John? Yeah, an irrigation ditch, thank you. You cannot do an irrigation ditch initially on Chol Moed and on Shemitah. Again, presumably because even if it's hefseid, it's considered too much tircha. You are allowed to do it on Shemitah initially, this irrigation ditch. And if you can't make it initially on Chol Moed, but if it sort of collapsed and is, you need to clean it out and and sort of re-strengthen it and fix it, that you are allowed to do. Now that's fascinating because I think most of us would have assumed that we should be shocked that you can do any of this on Shemitah, and we should have assumed that there would be more allowances on Chol Moed than on Shemitah, and here we find the opposite. So we're going to have to find out what is going on with Shemitah here.
But not on Shemitah? I understand.
Correct.
Make it with a Tchila b'Shvi, you'd certainly be allowed to fix it.
That's what. Oh no! Of course you can fix it. You can only. Even on Shemitah, you can even make it lechatchila. On Chol Moed, you can only fix it. The same way you can fix these irrigation canals, you can also fix other types of things that are used for sort of conveying water that have collapsed or that are in disrepair in the public domain, or for collecting water. Let's say it's for the masses to drink from. You have certain wells and whatever that you're allowed to do. V'chototinoton, and again, you can sort of dig them, not initially make them, but you can dig them out if dirt has fell into it, it's collapsed. Okay, that you can do. Now here we are introduced to presumably a third allowance, which is, I should say a second, which is tzorchei rabim. Right, so now we're not dealing with getting your fields irrigated. We're having the masses have availability of water. So we're dealing with tzorchei rabim, and that is allowed. Okay, and somewhat seems to be on a similar plane as the case of hefsei by the Chol Moed. Chol Moed, you can fix things, irrigation canals that are mekukalot, and these tzorchei rabim, these wells and other things, you can fix if they are mekukalot. Presumably, you cannot dig new ones. Okay, so. You can similarly fix the roads and the streets and the mikvaot. And here it just gives you the principle, all needs of the masses. You can designate the graves so the Kohanim know to avoid them. And you send out the shlichei beistin in order to supervise, make sure that people are not growing kilayim. Right. So yes. Okay. So we'll see about all of that. But anyway, at the end you have a whole collection of things that are tzorchei rabim. And again, questions to ask is, how much is there an issue here? Are there cases where this would be too much tircha and not allowed, or does this also have the issue of tircha or not the issue of tircha? But by your own private field on Chol Moed, the issue you have is if it's makam hefseid and if it's not going to be excessive tircha. Let's take a look at the Gemara. Hashta, says Gemara, Yesh Lomer Mimayan Shiyatza B'Tchila De'asilin Pulei. It's so fascinating which Masechtas begin by asking broad questions like, Minani Mili. Like, where is this whole idea about not doing malach on Chol Moed or something? No, here we start with a very narrow question. Like, we take everything for granted, and we just want to know why it had to say whether a new well or not a new well. Okay, so spring. If you can irrigate from a well that is brand new and that has more of a likelihood of needing repair because it's it hasn't sort of gotten like the walls and the structure and all that that are not have not sort of become deeply dug and established. So in that case, you're allowed to do it. So a well that has not just recently emerged, that we're not afraid that the banks will fall in. So mibaya, is there any question? Of course you can do that. So of course, the Gemara could have given the standard answer like a zu ve'ein tzarich lomer zu type of a thing. But let's see what the Gemara does answer. Omer, you'll say no. Itzrich. You needed to say both. If it said you can do it from a spring that has just emerged, which is a bigger chiddush, you were not afraid that it'll collapse and you'll have to do all the effort of redigging it. So I would have said, here's where we make a distinction between a field that needs irrigation and a beis habal, which we'll explain what that word means, what the etymology is, but it basically means a field that does not need irrigation, that's fine with rainwater. So that's why we're going to make a distinction, because we're dealing with a precarious type of a well, of a spring. Mishum da'asilin pule, we're afraid the walls might collapse. Aval, I would have thought if it's a mayin shelo yatsa b'tchila, it's a spring that has not recently emerged, that it's well established. There's no concern of collapse. In that type of a case, I might have thought, if we're not concerned of it collapsing and there's not so much effort, maybe I should allow it even in something that survives on rainwater, that doesn't really need the water so much, isn't a hefsed. Maybe even though it's not a hefsed issue, I would still allow it because there's very little concern. So Kamash Milan, lo shna mayin yatsa b'tchila, lo shna mayin lo yatsa b'tchila. Doesn't matter if it's a new one, doesn't matter if it's an old one. Beis hashalchin, in only a field that needs irrigation do we have an allowance. Beis habal, lo, not a beis habal. So therefore, rule number one is that the only allowance is makom hefsed. If it's not makom hefsed, if it's an issue not of hefsed but of the other phrase again about hefsed is minias revach. Right, so there's a difference. Is it about losing money or is it about not making a profit? Now, it's actually interesting, and I'm not going to get into this discussion, I'm just going to footnote it, that what do you deal with nowadays if somebody says, like, if I don't go into work on Chol Moed, right, they're going to, I don't know, cut my salary, or I'll have to use up one of my, sick days or something like that. So is that like minias revach, right? You're just not getting extra money. Let's not do the sick day case. So I'll have to give up my salary for that day, right? Is that minias revach? Or do you say, look, if you start the year assuming I'm earning a salary of X amount and I'm going to have to take a cut in salary, so on one hand, I'm not earning money for that day. On the other hand, I'm sort of losing, my income. So how exactly, do we always draw the line between those two is not always clear. But those are the issues. So the Gemara says if it's a base, if it's something that needs irrigation without that the crops are going to be damaged, that is a case of hefsed. You'll lose the crops. Okay, you don't say like, well, no crops will grow. That's just no revach. No, like if you don't have crops growing, that's a hefsed. However, if it's something that really doesn't really need it, can be fine with the rainwater. It's just making the crops better. That's an issue of revach, minias revach, and that's a case where there's no allowance. So the Mishnah is saying whether it's a, whatever the case is in terms of the wellspring, the allowance is only going to be for an issue of beis hashalchin, for a case of hefsed. It's not going to be for a beis habal where there's an issue of revach. There is no allowance. Now the Gemara gets to the different etymologies. These are Chol Moed. We're not dealing with Shemitah yet. Let's deal now with the etymology of these words. Where does this idea of beis hashalchin, you get the idea that it means a language of thirst. The verse says, and you were weary and tired and weary. The Targum is v'at mishalhi v'la'i, and you were thirsty and weary. So mishalhi is shalhi is thirsty, and they're playing words. Mishalhi and shalchin, the hey and the chet, are switching. Now that's probably
means thirsty?
Yeah. But Targum probably also means, I think, I don't know, you can check it. I think that actually that Aramaic probably even more means weary than it does thirsty.
That's off
weary and tired? Weary. So it's like faint and weary. So it's a little like of a double, 2 degrees removed. Weary meaning thirsty, and shalhi meaning shalchim. So it's really not the real etymology. I didn't look up what the etymology is, but I would imagine it would have to do with the word lishloach, because what you're doing is you're conveying water to the field, right? You're irrigating the field. So I don't know if Steinsaltz...
reviving it, so to speak, from its weariness.
Maybe. Anyway, but I don't know if does Steinsaltz give the real etymology of Beit HaShalchin? I imagine it has to do with conveyance of the water to the field. Okay. Right, exactly. So anyway, let's keep on going. So that's what it says is where that means a field that isn't thirsty, that is in need of water. Okay. Now, umay marshman to high beis habal lishin to miyas vusahi. How do you know the language of beis habal means settled? Whoever said it meant settled. But okay, sated and settled. Dichsiv, which is the opposite of thirsty. Dichsiv kiv al b'chor betula, as a young man will, have sex with a young woman. Umitargiminan arei kamad misosav ulam in betulta, like a young man will be settled with a virgin. And that fits the end of the verse because it's a metaphor for Bnei Yisrael. Yisyasvun begavayich banayich, your children will be settled in you in the land of Israel. So that's what it says. Beis habal is the opposite of thirsty, is a land that is sated, that does not really need regular water, and therefore there is no issue of hefsed. Now, by the way, the etymology seems clearer, right? Because the whole idea, I think we discussed this a little bit in Ta'anit, but the whole idea that rain, comes down and it penetrates the earth and then it's, fertilizes the seed in the ground and up from it sprouts crops, right, is very sexual in that imagery, right? And it's Mother Earth and it's being penetrated. And you actually have that in the Haftarah that we read by Ta'anit. What is it? What's the pasuk about? Ki kasher, no, that's not exact, but still, that's more like just rain coming from God. But what? Holy dafi hitzmicha, right? So it comes from God, it penetrates, it gives birth, and whatever. That's also the idea of rain and God, and which ties into the whole issues of ta'anit. So the Beit Habal is something that actually survives on the rainwater, right? And it's all playing off of that imagery. Now that's what I'd always thought, and then last night I checked the footnotes in Sonsino, and again I cannot, I'm not attesting to this or whatever, but whoever it was that wrote that, who did that, pointed to some scholarly discussion that it actually refers to the pagan god Baal, and because these fields were so fertile, so they were fields that were favored by Baal. Okay, and that might have to do with that. I'm sure that also plays into the same imagery, though, about about the whatever role that pagan god had or whatever. But surprisingly, that's not in the Gemara. So okay, so anyway, let's keep on going. Okay. So anyway, so only for fields that really need the water and that it's real hefsed. Okay. Mantana de pseida in harvachalo. Now we're getting to the core principles here, to the criteria. Who is the one that says that you're only allowed to do things on Chol HaMoed if there's a real pseida, not for the sake of profit, but for preventing loss? And there's two criteria, remember. And even in the case of pseida, we don't allow it with tircha because we don't allow rainwater. We only allow these wells that have already been established and so on. We don't allow things that might lead to tircha or that involve tircha.
So it means like a little bit of tircha, right?
No.
She says itself tircha.
Yes, right. So there's always a question of degree of tircha, correct. So that's also a question of how exactly you draw the line. I'm Rav Huna. So it says Rav Huna, Rabbi Linzer ben Yaakov. It's Rabbi Linzer ben Yaakov. Now we talk to Mishnah. Rabbi Linzer ben Yaakov Omer. Moshchines hamayim mi'ilan le'ilan u'avad shelo yashket hasadeh kula. That you can draw water from one tree to another. So water has collected around one tree. You can make a furrow to have it go from one tree and to go to another tree. And it's assumed here that the issues around the trees are like the Beis HaShalchin, are cases where that actually is a case of a hefsed. That you can do, but you cannot have it go, draw it from the tree and have it water the rest of the field. So the Gemara assumes that would be because, you could say it's a tircha issue, but the Gemara assumes it's because the rest of the field is a harvacha issue. So you see that Rabbi Linzer ben Yaakov does not allow you to do something for harvacha. So the Gemara says 1 minute. When did Rabbi Eliezer say his position, harvacha, the low? That you're not allowed to do things that are for harvacha. That's fine. You can only do things for hefsed. But we have a second criteria we have to address. Tircha b'makom pseida mishamislei. But when did you ever hear any position that if it's a pseida, that even in a case of pseida, you can't do it if it's a tircha? That we don't know. We know he doesn't want you to do harvacha, but where do we know our second criteria, that even in the case of pseida, if it's tircha, it's no good? So El Amar Rav Papa Hamani Rabbi Yehuda. It's Rabbi Yehuda. The Tanya we turn to Brisa. Mayana Yotzei Betchila. So here is the Brisa that presumably is the backstory to the Mishnah, a wider range of positions around the issue in the Mishnah. Mayana Yotzei Betchila. Mashki mimenu afilu stei beis habal. Diva Rabbi Meir. If you have even a brand new well, a brand new spring, you can irrigate with it even a beis habal. So Rabbi Meir is very lenient. It's a new spring, so you could be concerned that the walls will collapse or whatever. We're not concerned about that. And you can use it for a beis habal. You can use it even not for pseida, even if it's just for harvacha. So Rabbi Meir, very lenient. Divrei Rabbi Meir. Rabbi Yehuda Omer, Rabbi Yehuda, who now the Gemara is saying is the author of our Mishnah, Ein mashin elastei beis hashachin shecharva. You can only do it for a field that requires irrigation that has been dried, that is in need of irrigation. So just like our Mishnah. Rabbi Eliezer ben Azariah Omer, lokach v'lokach. Now, Rabbi Eliezer ben Azariah is the most extreme. Even if dried up field that needs irrigation, you cannot do. So Rabbi Yehuda is the middle position. Yes, okay, Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Yehuda went even further and said, Lo yifane adam amat hamayim v'yashkel leginato l'chorvato. You cannot redirect a irrigation canal and have it, and have it water your garden or your, your yard. B'chol Moed on Chol Moed. Okay, so what?
Means your yard.
Right. So that is now. If you take a look, Tosa says what these two things are. Ginato chorvato. Tosa says shabeit hashalchin. So number one, those are things that are hefsei. They are in need of water. Gina makom zraim. Chorba makom shecharvu ilonosav v'charshu v'zaru v'natu. Okay, so it's basically a field that it's in the process of being replanted. Okay, v'shemu tzarchamayim yos, and he goes on and so on. Okay, so anyway, so what we see is two things. So anyway, so let's see what the Gemara says. So the Gemara says, let's unpack this and then we'll go back. So my charva, what does it mean, a irrigated field that has dried up? If it's fully dried up, what good is it going to do to water it? It's like a brachal vatala. So that the current wellspring has dried up and now this other wellspring has emerged. Okay, so Rabbi Eliezer ben Azariah Omer lokach v'lokach loshna charva mayana v'loshna lo charva mayana. I don't care if the wellspring has dried up or not dried up. Mayan sheyatza. Okay, and either way you cannot do it. So mayan sheyatza b'tchila lo. If it's a, I'm sorry, did I just do? 1 minute. Hold on. Let me just check Rashi. 1 minute. Yeah, 1 minute. Right. So wait a minute. Before we get to Rabbi Eliezer ben Azariah, let's just take a stop and explain what we know by Rabbi Yehuda. So Rabbi Yehuda is telling us. So from here, Rabbi Yehuda, we see that Rabbi Yehuda is the author of our Mishnah in two ways. Number one is that Rabbi Yehuda says that you can go ahead and you can, if the wellspring has dried up, you can go ahead and and irrigate it from this ma'ayan. So that would tell you that's because it's a pseida. You're allowed to irrigate it, right? Because the wellspring has dried up. Let's take a look at Rashi, Rabbi Gershom. He spells it out. So if you take a look here, it's about 8 lines before the lines get wide. He says, Shecharva mimayin zev yatzam lamayin acher. Shecharav mayna sheregil lishtos mimenu. The kivin sheregil lishtos. This was the wellspring dried up, and now it's and it normally was reliant on it. So ilo mashkela achshav isla pseida yisera. If you don't continue to do it now, there's going to be a pseida. Afilu hachi, and even though we're clearly talking about a case of pseida, so number one is you see that Reb Yehuda is allowing it only because it is beis hashalchin and charva, so only not for hefset, not for revach. Right, Rabbi Meir allowed it for revach, beis habal. Rabbi Yehuda only allows beis hashalchin, so it's hefseid and chareva. That's number one, only hefseid. Now, how do you see the tircha aspect? So let's take a look. That's also a criteria. So Rabbeinu Gershom here continues. So the kivin shirgila 1 minute. Vafilu hachi. So we got a case of pseid, and afilu hachi lo shar Reb Yehuda elam mimayin sheyatzala. And even so, right? What's the case of the Breita? Mayan hayotzi b'tchila, only from a mayan. So the lav tirchahu, you're only allowed to do it from a mayan. Aval mega shamim umekilon to tirchahu lo shari afilu beis hashalchin. So basically, we see Rabbi Yehuda in our Mishnah because it has the same criteria as our Mishnah. A, we're talking about a beis hashalchin. That's the only case Rabbi Yehuda allows. And B, we're talking about a mayan, like our Mishnah. So the implication being that if it was more effort, like well water or rainwater, it would not be allowed. And we also see it from the second statement of Rabbi Yehuda. The Od Chazina, the Kamar Rabbi Yehuda, lo yifane adam, you cannot redirect the furrow, the irrigation canal. Alma de lo shar Rabbi Yehuda tircha yisera. Now, why not? As Tosas just told us, the Gina and the Chorva are cases of beis hashalchin, are cases of hefseid, and he doesn't allow you to redirect it. So you see that even with hefseid, tircha is not allowed. Alma masisim Rabbi Yehuda okay, and because Rabbi Eliezer ben Azariah is clearly much more machmir. All right, so is that clear? Or maybe I should write some of this down?
Yeah, maybe.
We have the Breita that basically says a case of a ma'ayan. Okay, that's the case of the Breita. Mayan sheyatza b'tchila, but we are not going to worry right now about the b'tchila. We have the case of the Ma'ayan. Okay, which means no tircha, not no, but whatever, no significant tircha. Okay, so what's the position? So Rabbi Meir says, Baal, right? Stay Baal. So basically, according to Rabbi Meir, you can do it even for Revach. Okay? Rabbi Eliezer ben Azariah says, Lo zeh v'lo zeh. Right? So, no even for Hefsed. Okay, now comes along Rabbi Yehuda, and he says, you can do it for what? For a Beis HaShalchet, right? Which means you can do it for Hefsed. Okay, that's what it's allowed. So that tells us one point. You're allowed to do it for Hefsed.
This is a
Okay,
Mayan.
that's criteria number one, Hefsed. But the fact that we're dealing with a Mayan says you need it both only for Hefsed and if there's no tircha. If it would have to be drawing it from a well or rainwater, it would be no good. And then we have the other statement of Rabbi Yehuda, which says you cannot what? You can't redirect the Amma, the Gal for your Gina and Chorva. Now, the assumption here is, as we just read in Tosfos, that that's like a Beis HaShalchet. Okay, that's a case of Hefsed. Why can you not redirect it? You cannot redirect it. Why can you not redirect it if it's Hefsed? It must be that the redirecting is again an issue of tircha. So you see that Rabbi Yehuda has two issues. It has to be Hefsed, it has to be Beis HaShalchet, or Gina and Chorva, and only if there's no tircha, if it's a Maya. If it means redirecting the Amma, that will not be allowed. Okay? So those are the issues. Let's take a look. So now we'll pick up the Rabbi Eliezer ben Azariah, 3 lines from the bottom. Rabbi Eliezer ben Azariah Omer lo kach v'lo kach, neither this nor that, nothing is allowed. Lo shna charev ma'inal v'lo shna lo charev ma'ina. I don't care if the well has dried up, then it's a hefsed issue. Ma'yan sheyatza b'tchila lo. You cannot do it from a wellspring, a new wellspring. Now, maybe he would allow an old wellspring. Maybe he's just saying a new one. I'm afraid it's going to collapse. So the Gemara says, Umimai. Well, how do you know that that's Rabbi Yehuda? Dilma, maybe Ad kan lokum Rabbi Yehuda Beis HaShalchet in Beis HaBaal lo. Maybe Rabbi Yehuda only makes a difference between Beis HaShalchet and Beis HaBaal. Ella Mayan Sheyatza B'Tchila. So only because it's a new wellspring. Maybe he's limiting here. And he's limiting it to case of Hesed because he's afraid this well will collapse. But if it's not new, if it's old, maybe he would be very liberal and he'd allow you to do even a Beis HaBaal. So how do you know that he's exactly our Mishnah? Our Mishnah doesn't distinguish between the type of Mayan. So Dilma Asi Lin Pule, because he's afraid it'll collapse. Of a Mayan Shalo Yatz B'Tchila. Maybe if it's an old Mayan, the Lo Asi Lin Pule won't collapse. I feel a Beis HaBaal Nami. Maybe he would allow you even if it's not a Hefsed. Right? So it's not exactly our Mishnah. He doesn't address that case. So the Gemara says no. In Kain Masnisin Amant Tamaria. Who else are you going to attribute the Mishnah to? So, meaning it's 90% overlap to the Mishnah. So he doesn't address the question of what if it's an old wellspring. Is he hypothetically not a different position? Yeah, but we don't find anybody else that the Mishnah matches up with except Rabbi Yehuda. So we're going to assume that our Mishnah is Rabbi Yehuda. Okay. So now the Gemara says like this. El Rabbi Yehuda, lo shnamayim sheyatz b'tchila, lo shnamayim shelo yatz b'tchila. Although in the Breita he's only talking about a new well, we can assume that whether a new well or an old well, a spring, Beis HaShalchet in Beis HaBaal lo. He will only allow Beis HaShalchet because it's hefsed. He only allows makom hefsed, not b'makom revach, and even there only when there is no tircha. The Haidiktani Mayan Sheyatz B'Tchila. So then, why does the Breita talk about a new well? If Rabbi Yehuda would allow a Beis HaShalchet even with a if he would limit if he would limit his heter to a case of hefsed, whether it was new or old. Why are we talking only about a new well? Lodicha kocha de Rabbi Meir, to tell you how powerful the heter of Rabbi Meir is. Dafilu mayan hayoti b'tchila, even if it's a brand new well and there's a concern it'll collapse, mashki mimenu afilu stei habal, he would allow you even to do a field that does not need irrigation. So Rabbi Meir is very lenient. He allows you even for Ravach, even though there's a concern that it might collapse.
So
Whereas
even
Rabbi
to-
Yehuda allows only for hefsid. Now, when it is a hefsid, he will. He allows only for hefsid. When it is a hefsid, he'll allow it even though it might collapse, even though it might collapse, but only in a case of hefsid. But Rabbi Meir, he will go so far that even if it's a case of revach, where you might have thought you want to limit the type of wellspring, Rabbi Meir will allow even a brand new well. Okay.
So even with your
Exactly. Well, possible tircha, right? It's not clear that Rabbi Meir would allow you like draw water from collected rainwater. This is the case where it might become possible tircha, but it's not right now possible tircha. Okay. But it is true that Rabbi Yehuda would not, if it was an old wellspring, Rabbi Yehuda would not give you more of a hectare. Okay. But we're talking about this case not to suggest that there would be more hectareum in the other case, but to tell you the chiddush that even in this case, Rabbi Meir is very lenient. All right, so now the Gemara continues. Itmar. Now we get on, so that's working out our Mishnah. And we basically get, as we said, to those two criteria about Mokum Hefsed and, and no Tircha, or no, okay, now, but we do allow a new wellspring, even though there might be Tircha. That's not going to bother us. That will allow, but not if there's definite Tircha. Itmar was taught. Hamanakesh v'amash gemayim lizroin b'Shabbos. If somebody is weeding or watering watering seeds on Shabbos that are in the ground, or weeding the area. So what you're doing is you're doing things that are encouraging and fostering the growth of the seeds that have been planted. What type of a malacha is that? We'll see how this will circle back to be relevant. So, mishum mai masrin bey. What hasra warning do we give the person if we want to, give them punishment in a beis din? You have to warn them. Now, there's an interesting debate in the Rishonim when the Gemara asks these questions of mishum mai masrin bey. If you just said, "Don't do that," it's a malacha on Shabbos. Would that be sufficient hasra? And he said, "I don't care. I'm doing it anyway." And he did it. Would we be able to execute him? So some say no. It's too generic. He doesn't really believe you. Some say, well, maybe that would be good. But let's say you didn't give a generic hasra. Let's say you gave a specific hasra, and you said, this is malacha X on Shabbos. So there, if you give the wrong identification, then he can clearly say, that was a joke. That wasn't what it was, and I didn't take him seriously. Okay, but the simple assumption of this Gemara is it's not enough to generically say it's a malacha. You have to be specific, but at least we can say if you are being specific, you have to be correct in your specificity. And this is the way the Gemara analyzes by saying what hasra do we give him is another way of saying which of the 39 malacha categories does it fall into. Okay, so what type of hasra would you give such a person? Rabbi Amar Mishum Choresh. It's Choresh, because what's Choresh? Choresh is plowing. Now, normally, choresh takes place before you put the seed in, although there is a type of a choresh that takes place after the seed is already there. And a choresh is a working of the ground that encourages the growth, that enables the growth of what's planted. Well, that's what's happening here. You're either weeding it or watering it, so you're doing something to the ground. The water doesn't go straight to the seed. The water is absorbed by the dirt, and from the dirt, the seed draws its nutrients. So you're doing something to the ground that's helping the growth of the seed. It's choresh. Rav Yosef Omer Mishum Zoreya. It's planting. Planting is about the growth of the seed. So this thing is also, it's not done physically to the seed, but it's about the growth of the seed, and therefore it's planting. So Amar Rabba, so said Rava, Kivasi Didi Mistaver, like me makes sense. Ma darcha shacharish l'rfuye ara, the same way chorish sort of softens the ground, improves the ground. Hainami m'rfuye ara, this also improves the ground, softens and improves the ground for purposes of planting. Amar Yosef, no, Kivasi Didi Mistaver, like me makes sense. Ma darcha shozareach litzmuche pera, the idea of planting is to cause fruit to grow, to blossom. Hachanami matzmiach pera, this also causes the fruit to grow, so that's what it's about. Now, how could we conceptualize what they're really arguing about? So Tosfos says what they're arguing about is how much, when you have to categorize a malacha, do you want to put it in the category that's most similar to it in terms of the physical activity, or most similar to it in terms of the purpose and the function? Because a tolada could be either. I'll give you an example, right? One tolada of cooking would be baking. Okay, baking doesn't look like cooking, right? I mean, okay, but it's, or frying or whatever. I mean, there are certain similarities, but basically it's another tolad of cooking is heating up a piece of metal and softening it to use it, to mold it, to shape it or whatever. That's That does not the same purpose as cooking, but it's similar in terms of the idea of putting something over a fire, changing its form, and so on. Okay, so there are times in which, I can give you other examples, there are times in which malacha sometimes is similar in terms of purpose, and sometimes is similar in terms of form. And therefore, seems to be the question, if you had to choose between which of those two categories to put it in, which one would you put it in? Okay, take a quick look at Tosfos, who says this. He says, Kamerfuye Ara, Tosfos says, the basar ikar malacha azlinan, the dom lechoresh, you call that ikar malacha, but I say the form of the malacha. Rav Yosef, avagav the ikar malacha dom lechoresh, although it's working the ground and similar to choresh, machshevas hanafesh, interesting way of framing it, lav refuyer. That's not the goal of it. You're not trying to improve the ground, you're trying to grow the fruit. Okay, Bahachi Pligi, the Rabbi Savar Lebasar Hamasim Adamin and Law, this is a clear explication of it. You go by the physical act, the lo achar machshava, not by your intent or the goal. Rav Yosef Savar Basar Machshava Zlin and Davi Ikar Velo Zlin Basar Hadimayon. Okay, dimayon means comparison, not dimayon like lead moat to imagine, but by how it's physically comparable to. Okay, so that's the debate. So let's get back to the Gemara. Okay. So, Amalei Abaye LeRabba. Abaye said to Rabba, who said it was Choresh, L'didoch kasha, Rav Yosef kasha. I got a problem according to you, and I got a problem according to Rav Yosef. L'didoch kasha, for you I have a problem. Mishum Choresh in, Mishum Zoreya lo. Okay, I get why it's Choresh, but isn't it also Zoreya? Rav Yosef kasha, I got a problem for Rav Yosef. Mishum Zoreya in, Mishum Choresh lo. Why is it only Zoreya? Why isn't it also Choresh? Of course, something can only be, it's not two different things that are taking place in the same act. It's one act, so you can't double categorize. You got to choose. So, if you want to tell me, if you got two things going on, you can only put it in one category, I'll tell you that's not true. Rav Kahana says, if somebody is pruning a tree, and they want to also use the wood that they're cutting down for firewood, chayev shtayim, that's two melachas. Achas mishum noteya, achas mishum kotzer. One for planting. Why planting? Because similar to, like we said, of zoreya, because it's getting the tree to grow. Planting is parallel to zoreya by trees. You don't plant seeds, you plant the tree. So it's getting the tree to grow. And it's kotzer, because what's kotzer? Kotzer is cutting something that's growing because you want to use the thing, like pulling a fruit off a tree. So here you're pulling wood off a tree because you want the wood. So the Gemara says, kasha, all right, it's difficult. Why there can you get a double category and here not? But I got to tell you, the answer is obvious. You know why? Because there you are actually having to do two separate things with the same physical act. You're both, and you could have been, and either one could have been an independent thing you would have done. You could have been cutting it to make the tree grow and not interested in the wood. You could have been cutting it for the wood and not interested in the tree growing. You happen to be achieving two goals with one act, but it's really doing two separate things, harvesting the wood and pruning the tree, what you're doing in the same act. So that gets you two malachas. Whereas in this case, you're only doing one thing. You're trying to weed the ground and water the ground so that the plant will grow. There aren't two things that you're doing. One thing. What does it mean when I water the ground so the plant will grow? Which category to put that in? So you can't put it in two categories. It's only one thing you're doing. You can only be in one category. You got to choose. Is that clear? The other thing, it was one physical act, but you were really doing two separate things with that one act. Here you're only doing one thing, and you have to choose the category to put it in. And that's the debate of Rabba and Rav Yosef. So the Gemara says like this. Okay. Rav Yosef kasha. I'm sorry, I skipped the line. So the Gemara said, where were we? Kash. Okay. Eisei Rav Yosef LaRabba. Now Rav Yosef, who said Zoreya, challenged Rabba. If somebody weeds the ground where kilayim is growing, or covers it up with dirt, the things that are growing, to help it grow, if the roots get exposed or something, then you get lashes. Rabbi Akiva says you get lashes even for just allowing kilayim. Question about is in lav shein bo maseh, but okay, even just allowing maseh kilayim to grow. Rashi says somewhere else that you did something, like you made a fence around it to protect it. So, but even if you didn't do anything about making it grow, but just about protecting it and allowing it, that you also get lashes. So let's look at the first opinion. According to me, that I say doing things with the ground is a form of planting. So damina mishum zoreya, doing things to the ground is a form of planting. That's why, because we know the Torah says you get lashes for planting. I consider that stuff a form of planting. You don't call that in the category of planting. You call that a type of furrowing. So Harisha Bikilayim Yasir, the Torah never says don't make furrows for Kilayim. It says don't plant. So how could you say that somebody could get lashes for doing that? That's not, according to you, that's not planting. So Amarle, he said back to him, Mishum Mekayin, yeah, the reason you get lashes there is not because it's an act of planting, but because you're sustaining it, you're protecting it. Okay? So the Gemara says, 1 minute, that's what Rabbi Akiva is saying. Say for the end says Rabbi Akiva Omer Af HaMekayim. Rabbi Akiva says you get lashes not just for planting, even for just letting them stay. So clearly the Tanakama is more limiting. The Tanakama says no, letting them stay you don't get lashes. You only get lashes for actually planting. So clearly that's a debate. You can't force Rabbi Akiva into the Tanakama. So to which Rabbi says back, watch me. So the Gemara says, Kula Rabbi Akiva. Yes, it's all Rabbi Akiva. Umatam kamar. And then you have to read it as one thing. Matam amenakesh famachapa bikilayim loke. Why do you get lashes for weeding or for covering the dirt? That's not zoreya. So why should you get lashes? Mishum Mikayim, not because of planting. It's not planting, but because it is letting the kilayim and doing some act that lets the kilayim stay around. Rabbi Akiva Omer Afa Mikayim, even if you just let it stay around. Ma time of the Rabbi Akiva, what's his reasoning? The time you turn to Brayta, Sadcha lo tizra kilayim, don't plant it, kilayim. Ainli ala zoreya, I only know you can't plant. Mikayim minaim, how do I know you can't even let it stay around? Talmud Lomar, Kilayim Sadcha Lo. So like a rereading of the verse and tweaking the order, just don't have Kilayim in your field. Even if you don't plant it, don't even let it be there. Okay, so clearly the simple sense of this, if this is totally like Rav Yosef, it distinguishes it that sees that working the dirt is a type of Zoreya, and Rabbi Akiva is the opinion that says you don't need to be Zoreya, just letting it remain there is enough. Rabbi rereads this to say it's all Rabbi Akiva and insists that actually doing stuff with the dirt is not a form of Zoreya. Okay, so that is the debate. Clearly, again, this seems to side with Rav Yosef, but they're maintaining their two positions, and we'll pick up tomorrow to see how this ties into issues of our Mishnah of watering the plants on Shemitah and watering the plants on Chol Moed.